let's get started. I think the one thing that we all would agree on is that blockchain has kind of been this tsunami that's moving through the internet identity ecosystem. And what we hope will happen as a result of this dialogue with you is that we'll all leave the room a little bit better about where those impacts are and how they might affect the work that we're doing today. So what I'd like to do, rather than giving you a lot of resume material, let's assume that everybody up here has something to say. I'm going to ask them kind of a two-sided question, one by way of introduction and the other by way of framing things, which is to ask each of my fellow panelists if they would mention one thing about their background, one salient experience or point of view that they have that informs their view about blockchain. So this will give you a sense of where the panelists are coming from and hopefully kind of set up a more robust discussion among ourselves and with you. So let's start with Steve, the salient thing.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, everybody. I'm a cryptographer and I'm a security. Is that okay? How's the sound? I'm a cryptographer and an identity guy for a long time. I read Nakamoto's paper in about 2010, 2011. Didn't mean much to me because I'm not a cryptocurrency guy. I didn't care about it. In about 2013, we saw a wave of blockchain identity startups, 20 or 30 of them. I went to the world's preeminent identity conference. That was actually before OWI started. And none of the identirati were talking about blockchain. So when you've got a situation where blockchain identity is being driven by blockchain people and not by identity people, that was interesting, and that was the thing that got me really interested in this.
I've spent 20 years in consumer internet, and for me, blockchain has the potential to be as disruptive, and I know that there's differing points of view on that, but to be as disruptive as the internet, but just like the internet, it's a question of what you do with it. So for me, blockchain is not necessarily an end, but a means to an end. And the applications for what happens on top of, or the capabilities of blockchain, is what I think has the potential to be disruptive. And that's how I'm kind of informed by my point of views and or skepticism and excitement for what lies ahead.
That's terrific.
Thanks. I'm Katherine Noall. I've been in the blockchain space for going on 5 years, and so I'm a real enthusiast. But having spent a lot of time trying to build things, including identity applications, it's very clear that we're in about 1992 in terms of the internet, and there are lots of challenges. Blockchain is really powerful and can solve some problems that we'll talk about later, but the idea that it can be used for everything or fix things or make your business better if you include the word in blockchain is not correct.
So I've been identity, and sort of similar to Steve. I said something about the same. I've been in identity for years before blockchain came along, and then I had the same observation. It's been seemingly led by blockchain folks rather than identity folks. I've tracked it for a couple of years now. My sort of journey started in serious research and analysis with it, with some work I did for DHS S&T. I wrote a report where I outlined security implications of blockchain-based identity solutions, and that really is, I think, what my main concerns are. Is that there are security implications with its use, and I think they're sort of underemphasized. We've even heard the terms, unhackable and secure by design, and I think there's a little bit of hyperbole there. So that's a concern to me. And then the other thing is because the effort's been led by blockchain folks primarily. It's driven to new models in identity. We start talking about identity in very different and new ways in the blockchain space, and some of them scare me a bit, especially the ones that are based on observation and observation of transactions and correlation.
Thank you all. Let me introduce myself. My name is Thibeau. I lead two organizations in the identity space. One is the OpenID Foundation, which is a standards development organization. OpenID Connect is one of the protocols that we've pushed out. The other organization I lead is the Open Identity Exchange, which is a bit of a sister organization that looks at governance for identity systems at scale. I guess the salient feature for me is a survey that we did of OIX members, and well over 80% of identity-oriented members, large and small, from our membership of at the board level to startups, all mention blockchain and identity. So I had been adopting Steve's skepticism and that of others, but I have yielded to the inevitable, which is developing a new idea called the Distributed Ledger Foundation, which will look not at the technology of blockchain, but the governance of these new business models that are products of this phenomenon that we're looking at in our industry. So we'll talk more about that, but I wanted to pose the first question, and I'll ask each panelist to give a crisp answer, and that is, please describe the ideal use case, the optimal use case for using public blockchains for identity. Steve, is this a null set?
Yeah, there are none.
Okay, thank you for coming, everybody.
Slightly more seriously, you asked us not to unpack the different architectures, so that's fine. So let's assume that we're talking about Bitcoin and Ethereum as the classic public blockchains, non-permissioned. There are permissioned public blockchains which are quite rare and quite new, and this is the stuff that Sovereign and others are working on, and I think that that's interesting. But if you're asking us to avoid that nuance, the thing about the public blockchain was that it was created so that Don and I, without knowing each other, could exchange large amounts of real value with no intermediary and with the security promise of reliable exchange of real value. We thought that 30 years ago that required an intermediary. So DigiCash was the first cryptocurrency in the 80s, and it required a digital mint. For 30 years, we cryptographers thought that it was an unsolvable problem that you could do peer-to-peer value exchange without an intermediary. And that's what Nakamoto solved. And that is absolutely magic. No intermediary, real money, very, very ultra-reliable. Don and I don't know each other. There's no intermediary. There's no trust. It doesn't have to be trust. It's good to trust, but it's better not to. The money goes through without an intermediary. I don't know what it is about that type of solution that has anything to do with identity. It is the opposite of identity. There's no key management. I don't know whose key goes with who. You're on your own. It's Wild West. If you've lost your key, bad luck. There's no recourse. There's no KYC. But more fundamentally than that, there's no key management. You don't know which person goes with which key, which is fantastic for Bitcoin. And that's all it does. Every other use case for that technology is a graunch. And every other technology that tries to put key management trusted third parties back on top of the blockchain is a mistake. And Nakamoto, herself, said so in the second line of the paper, said in no uncertain terms, if you've got a third party in your use case, then the benefit of my algorithm is lost.
Thank you. The ideal use case for the intersection of blockchain and identity.
So I'll step back for one moment and give a sense of the ideal case for a blockchain type of use case. And that is, and again, this is going back to some of the basics, but reminding ourselves that there's a notion of, as Steve just mentioned as well, which is another broker in town on trust, right? And so an environment or an ecosystem where there is a disintermediation, if you will, on trust, where there is a notion of decentralization at some level, and where there is a notion of permanent record or indelible record of events. And those types of factors that we've just talked about, I would propose to you, would then be applicable for, and as I said in the opening, it's a question of what type of use cases we put on top of this that actually realizes the value of blockchain. And I would propose that places where permanent record user control, et cetera, are of paramount, not of fun, not of convenience, but of paramount, are ideal use cases. And identity itself on the blockchain, I don't really know what that means. At some level, the notion of a namespace or an identity sitting on a blockchain is, and we believe, somewhat useless without associated, whether it's attestations or personal information attached to that. So again, going back to blockchain as a public blockchain, as a notion of an ends for identity, I don't necessarily see that ecosystem. Where I do see value in the ideal use case is where it can facilitate or make much more powerful something that I take very seriously, which is the notion of identity or a global identity in a public, indemnable, permanent record that can't be fidgeted with in the future.
Well said. Katherine?
Thanks, Don. The ideal use case using public blockchains is one where there isn't trust between parties. So particularly in international situations, whether they be international trade, commerce, perhaps international work, where there isn't great portability of national identities, then blockchain can provide a solution. But having said that, the idea isn't to put identities on the blockchain, but rather to use the blockchain to come up with better identity applications.
Tell us a little bit more what you meant by that last notion.
Sure. So the blockchain has some features which are very useful. They include timestamping, which can't be messed with. So in situations where there's a lack of trust or potential for fraud, that's great. The security of the blockchain can be used to make sure that applications are less vulnerable for man-in-the-middle attacks. So if you're transferring identities between partners, that's really useful. But what is not a good idea is putting identities or identity documents on the blockchain because it's not secure enough for that.
Adam?
Yeah, so I'll sort of sidestep the question a little by saying there's an answer I just saw last night on Twitter that I think encapsulates it perfectly, and so I would just point at that. It was an info page that was put up by, I think, DHS S&T. It's a little flow chart. It's got 6 blocks on it, and yes, no, and you sort of walk through the flow chart, and it starts. Do you really need blockchain for identity? And the first question is posed, and it says, no, okay, look at email. The second one, okay, no, look at a database. The third one, okay, no, look at something else. And when you finally check off yes to all those 6 boxes, you actually have a valid use case for blockchain identity. I have not memorized it. I saw it last night, so I'll just welcome you all to look that up because I think it perfectly answers the question. I think to take the other side of that for a second, I think the thing I don't see, and I think Steve alluded to it earlier, is the blockchain came out of, sorry to say the word, but Bitcoin, and it was built to solve the double spend problem, and I don't see the double spend problem here. So because of that, I'm sort of just always skeptical, even with that chart, that blockchain is really gonna help us here.
Great. Any other commentary on this question? We'll take it to the next, which I have as, please identify the business, technical, or legal blockers to using public blockchain for identity. We've done a bit of that already, haven't we? Do you want to put a cherry on top of the sundae in your null set answer?
Look, and this has been good so far because we're unpacking what it is that we mean by identity.
Yes.
And, Katherine, in particular, is talking about putting applications that are related to identity on the blockchain. And I think implicit in what you're saying, Katherine, is that you're decoupling some of these things from identity. Plenty of good work that I want to acknowledge that's been done about putting different pieces of metadata on blockchains or distributed ledgers, and the work that people are doing on verified claims on some of these things. So there's a new game in town, Verus One, was launched just a couple of weeks ago by Manu Sporny's group. We've mentioned Sovereign and Evernem Secure Keys doing work. I'm not here to pick apart any of those architectures, but I think what's really interesting is that they're much more sophisticated than putting identity on the blockchain. They're talking about verified claims and other forms of metadata. and exploiting the properties and thinking about the properties, as Catherine's just mentioned, there's permanence and so on. So that's good. You know, as architects, we need to work out what problem we're solving and to use the right type of infrastructure, data infrastructure, in order to produce identity outcomes. I think I'll leave it at that, because the other players have got solutions and contributions.
So we're looking for the legal blockers or the technical blockers or business model blockers that might inhibit the use of blockchain in identity. And I think, Katherine, you already, through your experience of having done this for a while, identified some, but perhaps the rest of the panelists would like to pick at some of those challenges that inhibit the join function between blockchain and identity systems at scale.
You could go
Looking
ahead.
at me.
You can-
Come back to me.
Sure.
So some of it, I at some level also feel, especially from our point of view, when we talk about globaliD and the notion of identity leveraging the blockchain, again, like the early days of the internet, I think some of the roadblocks or the challenges are the disintermediation or getting out of folks' minds that blockchain is equated to the notion of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. And I think, I mean, I've seen this, right? When we go in and we talk to service providers and you say the word blockchain, unless there's a significant amount of knowledge there, it can be and is frequently dismissed as the crypto world, and the crypto world doesn't feel safe. And so I would say, obviously, you know, there are technical, scalable factors as it gets more mainstream, if you will, when and if it gets more mainstream. There are certainly legal implications on what does it mean when blockchain is in the middle of a given vertical or transaction. But there is also just, I believe, this notion of a world where blockchain becomes more adopted, more accepted, more safe, as opposed to that crazy notion that's out there that's not safe or scalable or secure.
I have an answer. So I think in terms of business, I think the biggest one to me is that it always seems like the business model at some point comes to insert revolution here. There's no there's no just sort of, you know, there's no way to sort of incrementally improve, if you will, using blockchain. At least none that I've heard. It always seems to be, you know, complete disruption of an industry happens, and then we all use blockchain. I think that's you know, getting most things that happen incrementally, and so that to me looks like a blocker. And then there's the hype cycle. It's really tough. I think it's waning a little now, and so there's more sane conversation happening. But certainly, in a couple of years ago, like as Steve was saying, when, you know, blockchain sort of came into identity by storm, it was really tough to have a sensible conversation because so many people were just sort of, you know, pointing at it and saying, like, you know, things like it's unhackable. How do you have a sensible security conversation with the security implications using the technology when people cite that it's absolutely impenetrable? That to me is a blocker too.
There are some technical challenges, given that lots of these public blockchains are still in development. Means you're building on moving parts, which is a bit scary. So we're a few years away from mature technology. Having said that, it's still ready to be used at the moment. It's just more like the Wild West than you find in traditional technology. The other issue is that there are not lots of experts, blockchain developers, so that makes things difficult. In terms of the legal challenges at the moment, I actually have a different view in that what we're really talking about is a network, and depending on how you use it, maybe a database. And we haven't tried to regulate networks before or SQL databases. So I think we will see legal clarity, but it'll be around the things like tokens and data and what people do, people's behaviour, and not actually about blockchains.
It will be interesting to see how that legal clarity arises from the hype and hyperbole that is fueled by venture capital and aimed at our space. I was at On February 14th, I was at the House Science and Technology Committee, where the House members, Congresspeople, were trying to understand blockchain. And they asked the panel of illustrious experts, what's the single most important application for blockchain? And the experts all said, identity. Steve, blockers.
Well, we need to stop talking about metaphors as well, because the congressional explanations are all about trust and immutability and decentralisation. We need to be really concrete about this thing, because I think what happens is that the truth comes out. I think that the truth of the architecture is actually the blocker. Organisations like R3 and IBM, for that matter, the Hyperledger Fabric Consortium, the story that you repeatedly hear, the pattern that you repeatedly hear, is that Ethereum or Bitcoin are marvellous places to play and to understand trustlessness, to understand consensus algorithms and so on. And, you know, the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is doing a fairly good job of systematising that playground. The pattern that you consistently hear is that people will experiment, that's a good word, they'll experiment, they'll trial, they'll pilot, and then they'll go away and they'll re-engineer, or they'll go back to the drawing board, which is exactly what R3 did with Corda. It's exactly what IBM say proudly, we redesigned our thing. And the pattern that you're seeing there, of course, is that when the use case is more complicated than cryptocurrency, and, you know, cryptocurrency is as simple as it gets. Alice pays Bob, no other parties, no other complication. You're not going to borrow money on a blockchain. You're not going to put a pension fund on the blockchain. So 90% of banking is safe against cryptocurrency. Now there are secondary to that pattern, I've seen several really promising startups and really promising ideas launch on blockchain, public blockchains, Bitcoin and so on. And several really strong use cases then pivot. And there's a couple of examples where they have either stopped what they're doing altogether, the classic being land titles on the blockchain, or there have been other trading, and I don't want to name names because the reasons for pivoting are contested. But I think it's architectural. I think that when the people really get in and they start to move precious assets on the Bitcoin blockchain, they come to understand that when you're putting key management on top and you're binding, so if you're moving something precious, a car, on the blockchain, you need key management. You really need to get into that thing. So the off-chain processes matter. Off-chain is absolutely critical. Bitcoin, there is no off-chain. Doesn't matter what happens off the chain. If you fry your key, like I think Nakamoto's fried their key, I think that's the ugly truth, there's no way back. So things like Hyperledger, things like Sovereign, I think, things like the new Hedera, very, very acutely interested in off-chain processes and coming up with a much more sort of balanced type of architecture.
Yeah, I think we are moving into a new version, a new generation of a blockchain discussion that may still have some of the hyperbole and hype, but is moving towards more serious applications. Katherine, I think it'd be really helpful to this crowd if you would talk about your work in Australia and Asia, because we have a bit of a warped view in the US. We look through the prism of the wild, wild west that you mentioned. It'd be great to have you describe the work that you've been doing in other countries and other jurisdictions.
Sure. So Sphere Identity is based in New Zealand but focused on Asia, and we work very closely with the blockchain and identity communities in that region. What you see is that there's lots of exciting work going on and people testing out ideas. What you particularly see is lots of investigation around national identity solutions and governments considering the use of blockchain, and fortunately they're stepping away from that because I don't think they have the right architectures, to Steve's point, to use blockchain appropriately. And the other thing that's important is that because blockchain is global from day one, applications you put on it are global from day one, and therefore really not suited to national situations. The other point about the region in which we operate is I think the risk appetite is perhaps higher because the challenges, particularly around international trade and lives, are a lot bigger.
I remember in this congressional hearing, the soliloquy was, well, the U.S. has to retain its leadership in blockchain. And I don't know that that's true. Wouldn't you say the government of Singapore probably stands out as again, a very different approach, but a government pushing blockchain technology?
Isn't it kind of weird in a leaderless algorithm that anybody's obsessing about leadership? Sorry.
It's a political, it's a political context, and I'll ask Katherine if you have any experience with Singapore and those governments.
Yes, I do. So Singapore's being very open, but Singapore has been open to lots of industries and technologies, and I think that's just the way they do business, and that's worked very well for them in the past, and it's working very well for them now in terms of blockchain, which is great. And I think that's continuing, but you're seeing countries all around the place really trying to open up. What's really interesting, and I haven't had time to do it, but if you follow we're banning blockchain or we're banning Bitcoin, and now we're supporting it, press releases from countries all over the world, South America, Russia, and you follow that, there's lots of change of opinion, and that will continue to happen for a while. But I think the general trend is that there's less banning and there's more trying to work out how to do this. And in the Asian region, that work is happening very quickly.
And you were mentioning earlier, you see kind of a second generation of implementations, hybrid implementations. Can you talk more about that?
So yeah, I mean, if I think about 1 to 3 years out, how this becomes more mainstream, if you will, right? Or does it become more mainstream? I think about it from both ends, right? I think about it from a perspective of how does this help traditional, real functions that are happening today. Again, not to beat that horse, but if you go back to when the internet came out, it was great to be able to search that, but until traditional newspapers or magazines or print came onto the internet, it didn't really become mainstream, or traditional stores. And so the question is, when does blockchain help? And I know that there's been dabbling, whether it's home titles or it's diamonds or it's those types of applications. But the question is, when does it actually become mainstream? And then on the flip side of that, again, I look for a day when gone are the conversations that says, oh, let's put it on the blockchain, or let's use the block. I'd love it to just be like blockchain is any other technology that's being used, and it doesn't cause bells and whistles. And so I do believe this first phase, if you will, is very crypto heavy. This second phase is very understanding heavy. And this third phase, maybe I jumped, but 2.5 phase, or whatever you want to call it, is mainstream, both from a vertical penetration or a traditional value chain integration on one side, and on the other side, a yet another option for a technology use. And that's how I kind of see that second.
Let's come back to that, but I want to check one box before we go there, because that to me is where we want to end up in this discussion with our audience. But Adam, you've been working with DHS on some of their experimentation or their pilots around blockchain technology. Can you just summarize kind of the state of what the yield from that work has been, or what's in train for us to look forward to?
I think I would just cite a couple of the products that have emerged from it that Steve mentioned both earlier is the Sovereign and then Verus One, which are the sort of newer flavor of. I like to, when you get to that point, I do like to start to use the term distributed ledger technology as opposed to blockchain, which I do see as sort of different. I see distributed ledger technology as an evolution. And if you look at those efforts, they've done a couple of things well. They've solved a couple of problems that sort of drove identity folks nuts in the earlier days, like the idea that we're going to put PII on the blockchain. They're not doing that. They're putting identifiers, or I think they're called DIDs, but essentially a trust anchor that leads to quote off-chain storage where all the good stuff is. That I think summarizes it. I want to just highlight that what they all still I think do that is a little problematic to me, has been solved, is deal with the double-edged sword that is disintermediation. So we talk about blockchain as constantly as something that gets rid of intermediaries, and that's good, right? That's not always good. We have intermediaries in lots of systems, and they provide value. That's why they're there. We talk about governance, and sovereign, as an example, has a robust sort of governance structure. Well, that's intermediation. So yeah, I think the examples I would cite is sort of best in class to me, or those or that generation that is sort of distributed ledger. But still a couple of problems there.
Great. I think that this to me is really kind of cohering well, where we're beginning to share with the audience a sense of where this is going. Clearly, there'll be lots of hype and hope residual in the system, but the thing that I think is of interest to folks that look at systems through an identity prism and that of blockchain is, as Adam was saying, you have a common governance challenge, which is whether it's an identity system at scale or a distributed ledger system, you need to reconcile the fact that you're a widely distributed system, that you are by definition crossing jurisdictions, you're a global system, and you have to create a self-regulatory governance system. You don't have the benefit of traditional IT architectures where there was a prime contractor who assigned duties and liabilities to different actors. In these kind of trust frameworks, common to both identity systems at scale and perhaps distributed ledger system, somehow the stakeholders have to self-regulate. And that's not an easy business proposition or legal proposition to pull off. Any comments on that, Steve?
No, it's not easy to pull off, and it's the classic off-chain grounding, isn't it? Before I forget, I should say that a third thing came out of the DHS blockchain work, which is Adam Migus' security analysis. So Adam was involved with one of the projects and generalised the security analysis that he did, and I want to tell the audience it's one of the best security analyses of blockchain that you can find. So please look up Adam's work on that. Look,
Thanks, Steve. You still only get one beer.
It was really, really good. 2 beers. Look, it is about architectural fundamentals and marrying architecture to governance. I really believe that we need to remember that identity is just a means to an end, and I'm not being philosophical about this. This is an architect at the start of an identity-related program has to say to themselves, what do I need to know about the counterparties in order to manage risk? What do I need to know about these characters to be on a panel together? Not much. What do I need to know about somebody to exchange health records? Quite a lot. So what do I need to know about somebody? How am I going to get that data? And how do I know that it's true? And the really exciting thing about blockchain is that it has created new ways, new channels and substrates for exchanging data about each other, or for creating a place to find data. One of the unheralded things about the public blockchains are that they are insanely available. The availability is enormous. So that lends itself to a place easy to find, easy to rely upon, place to find some data. What sort of data do you want to put up in an environment like that? And I think Katherine noted that governments are a little bit toey about the globality and the publicness of blockchain. So, but the final thing is, don't forget the off-chain, because the stuff that gets onto the blockchain needs to be true before it gets on the blockchain. You know, whole books have been written about blockchain based on these bloody misconceptions about trust and consensus. The only consensus on the public blockchain is about the stuff that gets on there because you don't know where it's coming from. You know, there could be 10,000 double spends acting on a particular private key. The only reason why there's consensus in Bitcoin is that there's no other way to sort it out, which is why it's such a weird use case. Like, why would you consume so much energy on this planet in order to allow somebody to spend Bitcoin? You know, it's an artificial, crazy starting assumption that there's no other way to get to the consensus other than crowdsource. The other things that are happening off-chain that are much more interesting, the verified claims people, whether it's Verus1 or Sovereign or Hyperledger, they're all recognising that there are important things that you need to know about people. The truth of those things is normally established off-chain. So an authority will sign something like, this is Steve Wilson's health identifier. What's interesting about blockchain is that it produces new ways to make that truth available to people. So it's a medium. And if you can start to think architecturally, what do you need to know? How are you going to know it? How are you going to distribute these facts about people? I think that you then lend yourself to a critical analysis of these technologies.
So this last piece for the panel, and then we want to engage the audience, is really trying to identify 2 or 3 things in the very near future that will shape this discussion around identity and blockchain. As Steve pointed out, some of the work that Adam has done on a security analysis will no doubt be repeated in other venues. But I wanted to ask the panel if they could point out a couple of things to watch for in this ecosystem or this mashup between blockchain, distributed ledger technology, and identity systems at scale.
I think, so a couple of things that I've mentioned during our conversation I'll kind of wrap up with, which is a couple of things to watch out for, right, or see kind of as leading indicators. One is the increased education or the increased understanding that the audience has or that customers have on the notion of blockchain vis-a-vis cryptocurrency and being able to separate that out. I think that's one thing to watch out for. And I think until it's plagued with that misunderstanding, it becomes a barrier to what I believe the second key thing, which is, as I mentioned earlier, being able to penetrate into mainstream work streams today. And I think that also then dictates the degree to which this becomes a nomenclature within an IT department. It won't happen until 1 happens, 2 won't happen until 1 happens, and 3 certainly won't happen until 2 happens. So I think those are key things to watch out for. The other observation that I'll make is, and this is going a little bit in the crypto world, but I say this more as an observation of the industry. It has been, much to my surprise, an amazing experience to see the amount of wealth that has been created as a result of these innovations. And whether that is blockchain, whether that is Bitcoin, et cetera. And keeping that aside, I think because of some of that, there almost is an earned seat at the table on these conversations. And therefore, I have high hope that this wealth, these invested folks in the success of this will allow this to somehow become more of a larger phenomenon like the internet to stay in times to come.
Although blockchain is very exciting and occupies 24 hours of every day for me and my team, it is only the start. So what we're going to see in the next 3 or so years is the maturing of related technologies like distributed storage. And I think its impact is probably more interesting because if we think about data breaches, if you can distribute that data and not create honeypots and encrypt it, then that's a huge jump forward. So that's probably the most exciting thing. The other exciting technology to move on from blockchains are an increase in neural networks that are distributed. So for identity applications needing to process and verify huge volumes, they're particularly good, but they're probably about 5 years away as opposed to 3.
I'll give a real short answer so we can get to the audience. I think governance is something to watch out for. It'd be interesting to see how that ends up falling out. It's shaping up now. I'd cite Sovereign as an example of a place that's done some pretty robust work in terms of governance of their network. And the other thing I want to watch out for is what happens when one dies. So we've made this assumption, I think, that these things will all live forever because they're distributed. There's so many nodes out there run by so many folks that they'll never go away. But I think inevitably, at some point, one will. And when it's your identity provider for everything in this new world, what happens when it's no longer available?
All things must pass, even blockchains. I think to answer the question that I had posed was, I do think that this, the intersection between regulators and some of these new systems and these new business models is inevitable and important. Whether that regulator is on K Street here in Washington or in Beijing, clearly the Chinese authorities are looking at this phenomenon that is disproportionately housed in China. Most miners are in China. And the one thing that we know is the best predictor of the future is the past. And so it's not crazy to think about the Chinese regulators nationalizing or taking some dramatic action that would cascade around the globe as to the acceptability and viability of these new Bitcoin systems. So I think one place to watch is, again, where regulation meets these new business models and to see how that plays out. Any other last comments before we ask?
Yeah, just to add based on what you're saying. I mean, so similarly to what happens when one of them just goes away. Dies is a strong word. Well, what happens when one of them gets, quote, co-opted, right? So especially when you talk about these things in terms of self-sovereign identity, the general notion is we have this rich governance model, like the one that Sovereign's trying to create, so that it doesn't get co-opted. But everything that's a store of power, influence, or control becomes a target of co-option. And so, what happens when that happens?
Indeed, and these are breachable systems, and these are systems that have national strategic importance, whether you're here or in Asia. Some of the work that I'm going to be looking on are standards. Smart contracts. How do we know we have a good one? What's the difference between a legal smart contract and a code smart contract? So we'll be looking at how can we apply standards to smart contracts? Where's that role? How can we come up with best practices for governance? What does voting and consensus look like in governance terms so that we have a rule set that matches the tool set that comes to us with blockchain technologies? We have encoded governance in the IT system, and now we have to have governance that's going to be somehow acceptable to a set of global regulators. So it's going to be interesting times for these next couple of years. I don't know that any of us will be able to avoid the hype, which is fueled by venture capital, which is accompanied by the hyperbole we see at blockchain conferences. I was at a blockchain conference in California, and they were talking about use cases. And the favorite use case in California was using the blockchain to record transactions for marijuana distribution. And it was a really compelling use case, particularly when a cloud began to come from the back of the room, and all of a sudden the air conditioning system began to spread the use case around. So with that, I'll ask the audience for any questions you have. And sir, you.
I'm having trouble picturing my grandmother utilizing it and how that would work and how she would take care of her key and that kind of stuff. I'm really trying to get a picture of the use, how my grandmother would.
So to repeat it for the benefit of the folks online, we're talking about grandmas, but more importantly, we're talking about what does blockchain have to offer the huge identity challenge that are extant in healthcare systems, particularly here in the U.S. Anybody want to jump on that?
Can I say, please, with respect, let's stop putting it on the grandmothers. This is, and it's not just you, sir, but it's ageist. All of us have got to manage thousands of keys. We do it in chip devices. The usability, human factors engineering is not a problem of age, it's a problem of all of us. Okay, that's just the bugbear. The thing about healthcare is that we need to be careful. Most of these distributed algorithms are all about distributed consensus. And one of the architectural principles is that are you in a use case where there's something that you need to determine where you choose not to have an authority about that. You choose to let the crowd sort out something that's important, the truth of some property of the data. Now that's very important in Bitcoin, very important in some settlement banking, very important in some trade situations, cargo manifests, there's no obvious point of authority. But I saw some blockchain demonstrations last week, electronic health records on a blockchain. And the demonstration, it didn't matter what was inside, it wouldn't make any difference to Grandma or me what was in the engine. The patient was consenting for a record to be sent onto a ledger, patient, doctor. And I said to the people, where's the consensus? Why would you get anybody other than the patient and the doctor to think about that decision? Is it going to happen or not? So the architectural thing is if you're going to use a distributed ledger for that sort of thing, work out whether it's the type of decision that you need to make on a consensual basis or whether it's just point to point. But there are some other properties I'm sure that other people would like to speak to.
I'm just going to give a real short answer to that one. I don't see it. I don't, for mostly the reason that Steve said, I just don't see a use case for blockchain in healthcare, primarily because the need for consensus isn't there. In my experience dealing with healthcare providers, I just don't see the requirements matching up.
But what if it's a permission distributed ledger and it's not just point to point? What if I have multiple healthcare providers and I want to leverage a distributed ledger for that? You know, because for multiple points.
So just building on that for a moment, I do think the question is indicative to some of what we've been talking about earlier, which is distilling between the notion of blockchain remaining in the academic and unapplicable world to it actually falling into the hands or getting into the hands, as I mentioned earlier, in the mainstream world. Healthcare and grandmas is one example, but that's a proxy for the notion of mainstream. And I do think while not addressing the healthcare specifically, this also underlies the notion of the balance between privacy and security, right? And so that balance between privacy and security means not everything is going on the blockchain, but what is beneficial to go on that blockchain, and where is that line between what is applicable and helpful to be in the public domain and not harmful to the end user, but also where is that line between what is actually considered PII, right? And so in that, and that should not go on the blockchain, and there's not a use case there from a healthcare perspective. But I might suggest something where there is a name or a namespace or grandma's on the blockchain, there is an attestation or a verification or whatever word you want to use that says, yes, this person, you know, has valid insurance or whatever that attestation provider is verified. And then there is the PII that is attached to the name or the material that's on the, but is not available in a public domain and is only given in a user permission controlled environment. That is to say that, yes, that given X-ray is, you know, in a vault, yes, that I approve that that PII gets sent. If in fact that's deemed PII and if in fact that's durable, that can get sent in that doctor's situation. So I don't want to get too detailed in that specific use case, but what your question does surface is this notion between what is that right line between privacy and security such that it engenders trust, and that notion of, which I really like, which is how do we get this out of a bunch of academic white papers and applications that are still not connected to good old consumer apps for mainstream.
I wish we had more time for questions. I do apologize for not giving that because soon we're going to have lunch on the blockchain. So, I hope you agree with me that this has really been a great panel. I think we've accomplished our goal, which is to provide you a bit of a sobering look at this phenomenon. It's not going away. It's going mainstream. And I'm sure that most of us will go along with it. So if I may, a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you later in the afternoon.